I don't really like a lot of attention, but in this case, I'm going to go as quick as I can today because I got a lot to cover, and I don't want to go over, but I'm afraid I might. Lesson today is the beauty from the broken. We are still following up from, I think, 2 weeks ago, and then 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago, or whenever. We're still talking about the life of Joseph. And he had quite the life. And today what we want to cover and what I want you to get out of this is that you're going to surrender your past to God and let him make something beautiful out of your brokenness. Couple focus verses to just set the thing for it here. In Genesis 45, verses 7 and 8, God sent me before you, this is Joseph talking, to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and he hath made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. And then in chapter 50 and verse 20, but as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now we could do roundtable discussion on brokenness and the good that comes out of it, and the life of Joseph, the life of Job, for that matter, different ones. But we're not going to have time to cover all of that. Now, the lesson text is actually 49 verses long, so rather than go into through 49 verses through several different chapters, I'm going to give you a synopsis here. In Genesis chapter 45, Joseph revealed who he was and sent his brothers home to return with the rest of his family. And then in chapter 46, the family returned back to Egypt. In chapter 47, talks about Jacob living 17 years in the land of Egypt, from 130 years old to 147 years old. That's when he passed away. And then made Joseph promise to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, when he died, and that is where Abraham, Isaac were buried. Rebekah and Sarah were buried there, as well as Leah, which is Jacob's wife. Remember, his favorite wife, Rachel, was buried beside the road on the way to Bethlehem. But anyway, at chapter 50, the brothers sent Joseph. They sent to Joseph a messenger to have mercy on them and forgive them, because they were afraid of what he was going to do since their father had passed away. And Joseph had already forgiven him, told him, now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. And the point we want to understand today is that God not only knows how to take what is meant for evil and make something good out of it, he actually does it. He knows how to do everything. He doesn't always do everything. If it's for your good, it's going to happen, though. Corrie ten Boom and her family were sheltering Jews from Hitler's Nazis. She was sick with the flu one day when a man came to their little watch shop and insisted on speaking with her. The nervous Dutchman told Corrie that he and his wife had been sheltering Jews as well, but his wife had been arrested and he needed some money to bribe a police officer for her release. But instead of the Dutchman, the Gestapo arrived to raid their house and arrest Corrie's entire family. Corrie said, there is an old Dutch expression, you can tell a man by the way he meets your eyes. This man seemed to concentrate somewhere between my nose and my chin. Altogether, the Gestapo arrested over 30 people who were in the ten Boom home that day, releasing most of them soon after that. But Corrie, her older sister Betsy, and their father Casper were held in prison. Casper, her father, died about 10 days later. Corrie was initially held in solitary confinement and taken to her first hearing after 3 months. And at her trial, she spoke about her work with people with mental disabilities, and the Nazi lieutenant scoffed because the Nazis had been killing those with mental disabilities for years in accordance with their eugenics policy. They were trying to purify the race, etc. So Corrie defended her work by saying that in the eyes of God, a mentally disabled person might be more valuable than a watchmaker, as she was, or a lieutenant. But she found that the man who had come into their shop the day of the raid was named Jan Vogel. Now, that might not be the Dutch pronunciation, but we're going to go with it. He had been collaborating with the Germans since the first day of occupation, And in her book, The Hiding Place, she wrote how she was feeling at that moment. She said, "Flames of fire seemed to leap around that name in my heart. I thought of Father's final hours, alone and confused in a hospital corridor, of the underground work so abruptly halted. I thought of Mary Italy arrested while walking down a street. And I knew if Jan Vogel stood in front of me now, I could kill him." This man, one of her own Dutch countrymen, had betrayed Corrie, her father, her brother, her sister, and everyone they had been helping. Must have felt impossible to believe that anything good could ever come from such evil circumstances, but the story wasn't over. Now, unlike a couple weeks ago when I gave you a story and didn't finish, I'm going to finish that one today. But the effects of betrayal include shock, loss and grief, morbid preoccupation, damaged self-esteem, self-doubting, anger, and these effects produce life-altering changes. The effects of a catastrophic betrayal are most relevant for anxiety disorders and for OCD and PTSD in particular. They've come up with a name or a label for this. It's called betrayal trauma. Betrayal can cause several different post-traumatic stress disorders with symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares and impaired sleeping, depression, anxiety, brain fog, distrust, and dissociation. In other words, a detachment from every disconnection and all from those around you, alienation, which basically you turn into a loner. You don't want to be connected or close to anybody. And it's highly possible that Joseph experienced this betrayal trauma, including the OCD and the PTSD. And the more I thought about this, I thought it could be that his OCD is what made him such a great overseer in Potiphar's house. Oh, this guy, everything's perfect with him. But he was suffering from the trauma of his betrayal. So up in Canaan, the famine began pinching the food supply of Jacob's family. So crops failed, emergency stores ran low, and before long they were facing the very real prospect of starvation. But somehow, probably from travelers, traders, whatever that came through there, Jacob learned there was grain in Egypt, so he sent his 10 eldest sons south to buy food for the family. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Jacob, he was in his 70s when he met Rachel. Worked 7 years for her, another 7 years for her, because the first time around they gave him Leah instead. And so he was getting quite elderly. But Jacob sent his sons to buy food for the family, his 10 eldest sons. So like a skilled author, God was drawing the strands of the story together. Tension mounts for the reader if you're reading this the first time and you're looking at all this stuff going, hey, what, uh-oh, they're going to Egypt. Here come the fireworks. Because you can see that Joseph and his brothers were on a collision course. What'll happen when they meet now that the power dynamic has reversed? Joseph was royalty in Egypt. His brothers were commoners and strangers in the land. But over 20 years had elapsed since Joseph's older brothers had thrown him into a pit and sold him into slavery at about 17 years old. He was no longer a boy of 17. He was almost 40. In my opinion, between 38 and 39. I read somewhere that somebody said 37. Not quite sure I buy that one. But he was in the prime of his life. If you want to know where I got all those numbers, you can ask me later. Where once his brothers had stripped him of his coat of many colors because he was daddy's favorite, now he was dressed in the finest linen of Egypt and decked in gold. Where once he had cried out to his brothers from the bottom of a pit, now he was standing in regal glory in front of them and over them. His transformation was so complete that his brothers didn't recognize him. Yeah, it's over 20 years, people change a little bit. They bowed before him just as his dream had foretold when he was young, but he most assuredly recognized them. Now, it looks like Joseph was undecided at first about what to do with his brothers. He didn't reveal his identity to them at first, but he decided to test them to see if they had changed inwardly over the past 20-something years. So he accused them of being spies and held them in prison for 3 days. This does not make up for being thrown in a pit and sold to a foreign country and being on the receiving end of slavery and imprisonment for a total of 13 years. But then he sent them on their way, all except Simeon, and he kept him in prison as a hostage. Now, you'd have to go back and look at the whole story and see, why did he pick out Simeon? I think Simeon, no, he wasn't the oldest. Reuben was the oldest, I think. Anyway, move on. So he kept him in prison as a hostage till they brought back Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. So they got back home with grain for their family. Jacob refused to even consider sending Benjamin back. Eventually, the grain that they had bought was gone, and Jacob reluctantly sent them back to Egypt with Benjamin. There's a lot of other story in there, chapters of the Bible devoted to this whole story. But he let them go back with Benjamin, and this time Joseph received them a little bit differently. Instead of putting them in prison, he freed Simeon to be with him, took all of them back to his house, and ordered his servants to prepare a feast. The next day, Joseph sent them on their way, but he told his steward to hide his silver cup in the mouth of Benjamin's grain sack. And no sooner had they started on their journey than he sent his steward pounding after them and accused them of stealing the cup. And they said, "Oh no, we wouldn't do that. You know, if you find a cup in one of our bags, you know that person can be your slave." Blah blah blah. Be careful when you make rash promises. You don't know the whole story a lot of times. Don't play another man's game is another one that goes along with this. But when it was found in Benjamin's sack, the other brothers' reaction was telling. Where once they had willingly sold Joseph to be a slave, now the very prospect of losing Benjamin to such a fate was horrifying to them. They tore their clothes, a sign of deep mourning and grief, and they returned all together as one to face Joseph. And when they got there, Judah offered himself as a slave in the place of Benjamin, pleading for mercy for the sake of their father. They had truly had a change of heart. Now, some might think it was cruel of him to play this kind of mind game with his brothers, testing them to see if they had changed, but it's interesting. It's a real interesting what-if scenario to wonder what Joseph would have done if it had turned out his brothers hadn't changed in all those years. Things could have been quite a bit different. But the fact is, all of them had changed over that 20-something year period, Joseph included. So just as he put his brothers through tests, so he too had been tested and tried by God. He was no longer the naive teenager who delighted in bragging to his brothers and his parents about his dreams. He had been thrown into a pit, survived a slave march to Egypt, risen and fallen in Potiphar's house, languished in prison for over 2 years, and he had ascended to the palace. But even at this moment, with his brothers completely within his power, Joseph was being tested. Had he changed through all he had been through? And if so, had he changed for the better? So Genesis 37:2 says that Joseph was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali. We talked about that last time, I think 2 weeks ago. And with the sons of Zilpah. Now these were the maids of Rachel and Leah. So that would the sons of Zilpah would have been Gad and Asher, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Joseph was a tattletale. Or maybe he felt obligated to protect his father's interests. I don't know. But when Jacob sent him to his brothers when he was sold off, the Bible doesn't say which of his brothers were tending sheep or if they were all there. It only mentions Reuben, who suggested throwing him in the pit so he could rescue him later, and Judah, who suggested selling him to the Midianites. Maybe that's why Judah was so eager to offer himself as a slave. A bit of guilt there. So in Genesis 45:3, Joseph says, "I am Joseph, doth my father yet live?" And his brethren couldn't answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Now imagine for a moment if you're Reuben or Judah or one of the other brothers who was there when he was sold. What are you feeling at the moment? Holy cow, it's over. We're in big trouble here. We are up to our eyes in kimchi. So when they threw him in the pit, Joseph was close enough. Well, I wonder if the pit was close enough that he could hear them talking, wanting to kill him, wanting to sell him. What do we do with him? Joseph sees that they have had a change of heart, but they don't know how the years have changed him. They were probably still expecting the sword to fall, but evidently they couldn't even reply to his question. They were troubled at his presence, is what the scripture said. And he said, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near, and he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life." I don't know where he paused in the conversation. But if he paused with, "I am Joseph, your brother," oh yeah, that was a bad time. "Whom you sold into Egypt." Holy cow, he remembers. Yeah, it'd be kind of hard to forget that. But notice how carefully and kindly he approached the reunion with his brothers. He asked them to come near to him. He wasn't demanding. He didn't push them away. A lot of hard conflicts could be resolved peacefully if we follow this example. Addressing an issue face-to-face and with kindness is so much more effective for resolution than lashing out from an impersonal distance. Read text, a Facebook post, Facebook Messenger, or even that, a voicemail. But just like was brought up at the men's retreat during our verbal abuse discussion, encouragement is much more effective than criticism. But then next, Joseph dropped a huge truth bomb on him. "I am Joseph, your brother." But if Joseph's words, "I am Joseph, your brother," lifted their hopes a little bit, okay, he's our brother, maybe he's not gonna, Then he says, "Whom you sold into Egypt." Yeah, he didn't ignore the so-called elephant in the room. He brought it right out. Nothing can be healed until it's been brought out in the open air. If an issue is causing conflict, it has to be addressed. Otherwise, people just keep it in here going over and over. But rather than getting hung up on the harm that his brothers had done, he forgave what they had done and focused on the good God had brought. Now, this doesn't mean it's okay to torment and irritate your brothers and sisters, to develop patience in them and teach them to be long-suffering and forgiving. That's not your job in life, is to make other people do better. It's okay to lead them to God, but you're not the one to try to get them to develop patience. That will happen on its own, probably with no help from you. As the English poet Alexander Pope once wrote, "To err is human, to forgive divine." Without God, Joseph would have likely executed a pretty bad revenge on his brothers for what they had done. Slavery, torture, death, all those things were within his power, and some would argue well within his rights, because of 13 years he had suffered through slavery and prison. But Joseph chose to forgive. So Joseph told them that 5 years of famine were still to come. That's how I figured that part of that. That's how you figure up his age and stuff and when they came. So he, trekking back and forth to Canaan for the next 5 years is really a bad supply issue. So it wasn't a reliable long-term plan. So he says, "Why don't you all move here?" Besides that, he wanted to see his father again. So Joseph sent his brothers home with food, wagons, and provisions for the journey to bring their father Jacob and all their families back to Egypt to ride out the famine. Now, there is a scripture that talks about this, but God's plans are greater than our plans and his ways higher than our ways. We look at things and go, what in the world is going on? And God's trying to go, hey, hang on, it's not over yet. In Isaiah 55:8-9, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Paul wrote in Romans 11:33, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. But rest assured that God has a plan for your life. Paul also said in Romans 8:28, "We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." So if you are the called according to his purpose, and if you love God, consider every pit you've been in, every mile you've walked in chains, every day of hard labor, every trial, every trouble, every heartache, false accusation, every day in prison, every year you have spent forgotten. God is taking all of that and he's working it all together for your good. Paraphrasing Brother Bernard, Dr. David Bernard's message of Romans, he says, some manuscripts say all things work together. Others say God works all things together. God is in control of our lives, and he will not let external circumstances thwart his ultimate will for our lives. He will never permit something so terrible that he cannot correct. Remember, we talked about a couple weeks ago, I think, when I was teaching, talked about God doesn't write tragedies. The author got you into the mess, he'll get you out of it. When things look impossible, if God's writing your story and you let him, everything's going to be fine. But if you want to fight against it, no, I refuse this, I refuse that, you're going to write your own story. You're not nearly as good at it as God is. So he'll never allow a trial too big for us or a trial with no way of escape. Even when Satan causes evil to fall on us, God is going to bring good despite it. God can even use that evil to make good things happen. Romans 8:28 doesn't mean we can always identify positive results from every trial or tragedy. Same way we've used the example before of, do you like flour? Do you like eggs? Well, I don't want to eat a raw egg, and I don't want to eat flour, and sugar by itself is, you can only do so much of that. But once you get all the things put together and make a cake out of it, it tastes pretty good. And this is sometimes how our life works out. Individual things were not that good, but when you look back over your life, God has used it. Sometimes your life's up and down and everything, but if you look back, you're a lot higher than what you were before. So all things work together to bring ultimate good. And ultimately, he's going to use that to get us to heaven. The individual ingredients of a cake, not so good. The results, 2 thumbs up. A lot of different colors, dark and light, blend together to produce a beautiful tapestry or painting. All of life's experiences taken together mold our character. They make us what we are and bring us to where we are. I remember Pastor talked about when he was in Bible college, I don't remember which class it was, but they said, I would take a piece of paper and write on it the things in your life that happen, the things that you wish you could change. And he thought about it a little bit, wrote his name on the paper and turned it in blank. Everybody's over scribbling away and their stuff, and the teacher's going, oh, so you lived a perfect life? He said, no, but everything that I went through made me what I am today. And I wouldn't want to change any of that because I wouldn't be who I am. Sometimes making stupid decisions makes you a better person if you're smart. Sometimes other people making stupid decisions makes you smart. But sometimes trials motivate us to serve God. Sometimes they develop our character, or they keep us in a state of dependence upon God. We usually don't like those times. We don't like having to ask God for our daily bread. We'd like to see it, months and years out. Everything's going to be taken care of. And sometimes God has to remind us, it's not up to you. I thought I stayed in the Army for, what would you call it, security. But when I got out, I went for, the first, I don't know how long it was. We left Bible college, and we stayed with Brother and Sister Carnley. I didn't have a job except I worked 2 days as an emergency hired guard for prisoners. Everything was taken care of. We ate, we had a place to stay, bills were paid, everything was taken care of, and God said, you thought you were doing it. Okay, God, you're right. But without the trials, only God knows what we would be like. In the end, when we reach heaven, look back on life as a whole, we'll be able to say, all things worked together for good. Or, he worked all things together for good. Now, this promise is only to those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. If we don't love God with total commitment, or if we're not living according to his plan, then we need to repent and correct our lives before we can claim promises, or the promise. Now, I kind of wonder if that That God part is from the Shema. But Jesus referred to in Mark 12, 29 and 30, when he said, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. In other words, love him with all your being. This is the first commandment. So God is taking all of that mess and junk you go through, and he's working it all together for your good. And just like Joseph, when the timing is perfect, whether in a single day or not, you may go from the prison to the palace. All the mess you're going through could all disappear in a moment. Don't necessarily know that the Publishers Clearinghouse is going to show up at your door with the big check or anything, but you never know. And when all this happens, it's not so you can have glory or comfort or revenge or anything like that. It's not about you. But God is doing it all so you can make a difference for others, to save them or to give them hope, seeing that you came forth victorious. Say, hey, in fact, Brother Cunningham wrote a book, If I Can Do It, Anyone Can, talking about starting a church. So Joseph's brothers returned to their father Jacob with incredible news. Not only was Joseph alive, but he was second in command at Egypt. And at first, Jacob couldn't believe it. Now, you can understand why he'd have a little trouble with that. Going from he's been dead for 20-something years to, whoa. But when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent and all the provisions and stuff, he said that was proof enough. So can you imagine being a fly on the wall when they broke that news to Jacob, the son he thought was dead? Now he's the number 2 honcho in Egypt. How'd that happen? How would we know? Did they confess to telling him? Selling him? Confess to their father? Telling him, yeah, we sold him into slavery. You what? He might have treated them a little worse than they could have expected from Joseph. Maybe they pretend they didn't know how he got there. The Bible doesn't say, so we can only guess, but it would only be a guess. The entire family packed up, moved to Egypt. Then Joseph arranged for them to live in the land of Goshen, apart from the Egyptians. 17 years later, the time came for Jacob to die, and he blessed Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Then Jacob gathered the rest of his sons around his bed, prophesied over them, and blessed them. When he died, Joseph had him embalmed in Egypt. And then all Jacob's son traveled back to Canaan to bury him in the cave of Machpelah again with his ancestors. So after their father's death, Joseph's brothers were afraid Joseph was going to finally take revenge on them because they thought that his father had been the one that was maintaining the goodwill. But they sent a messenger to Joseph saying that Jacob wanted him to forgive him. And they came themselves, fell down before Joseph and said, Behold, we be thy servants. But vengeance was so far from Joseph's mind that he broke down in tears. He told his brothers, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore, fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. Now, it could have been that not only was he forgiving and God was moving through him, but he just got a little wisdom with his age. Again, what I said at the beginning, God not only knows how to take what is meant for evil and make something good out of it, he actually does it. When the devil sends something that he wants to use to destroy you, God can reshape it into something powerful and good. The devil sees an addiction to drugs, alcohol, or pornography tearing your life apart. But God sees deliverance, a testimony, and a chain-breaking ministry. The devil may have brought sickness, disability, the death of a loved one. He hopes tragedy will crush the life out of your faith. But God sees an opportunity to give you more grace, to pick you up, to wrap his arms around you and carry you. If you've never been at the bottom and actually felt God's arms around you, you don't know what it's like. Ultimately, God will use you with your hard-won empathy to reach out to someone else who's going through the same thing you went through. God has no trouble accomplishing his will. He only has trouble with the vessels he wants to use. That's us. You have to yield to God's will so he can turn your brokenness to beauty and use you. And sometimes we look at situations and go, well, God, why in the world did you do it like that? Why didn't you protect me from this? Why didn't you stop this? Why'd you let him put him in the pit? Why'd you let him do this? How come this happened? God has ways past our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and he's looking for something a little bit better down the road. It's the same as when you raise chickens, you rear children. You rear your children. It's not about today. It's about their future. So when they're going, well, I wanna, it's like, no, that's not what's best for you. I want you to be a productive citizen down the road, not end up in jail. So, we all have brokenness in us. Brokenness is part of the human condition. It comes from our fallen nature, from the consequences of sin, from our own imperfections, from our own life experiences, misunderstandings, bad decisions, or being around bad people. But brokenness is not the end. Brokenness gives God an opportunity to flow in our lives. He picks up the shattered pieces, submerges us in his spirit to soften us and make something beautiful out of our lives again. Unpleasantness in our lives isn't the end of the story. In Philippians 1:12, Paul wrote, "But I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel." So, Corey and Betsy were sent to different camps together. They were sent two of them, I think, in the Netherlands, and then they sent them to Germany. They sent them to Ravensbrück concentration camp, a women's labor camp in Germany there. They were leading secret Bible studies in their prison barracks, but Corey became so consumed with anger and hatred that she couldn't even lead the Bible study meetings anymore. She sat at her workbench working blindly on German radios. She became sick. She tossed and turned at night. She couldn't sleep. But her sister Betsy seemed perfectly fine except for her health. Finally, Corey burst out to her one night, "Betsy, don't you feel anything about Jan Vogel? Doesn't it bother you?" Betsy said, "Oh, yes, Corey, terribly." But then she went on to say that she prayed for him every time his name came to mind. "How dreadfully he must be suffering," she said. Convicted, Corey pressed her face into a straw-stuffed mattress, prayed for forgiveness for the murder in her own heart, which she realized was a sin as bad as anything Jan Vogel had done to her. She prayed blessings on him and his family, and that night, for the first time since she had learned his name, she slept peacefully. Oh, that people would do that with their hatred. Let it go, forgive, get on with life, and not let somebody else ruin your life. She didn't know that this was the first step in letting God take her brokenness and make something beautiful. She prayed blessings on him and his family and slept peacefully. But in relationships, they said it takes 1.5 to 3 years to get over a betrayal. And I wonder if, and if so, how long Joseph hated his brothers after their betrayal. Might have been a different story if there had been an instant turnaround and they had had to come there within that first 3 years. In fact, it might have been 5, 6, 7, 10 that he had to go through this. Now, through the 2 sisters' teaching and examples, many of the prisoners were converted to Christianity. And while they were in prison at Ravensbrück, Betsy and her sister began to discuss plans for founding a place of healing after the war. Betsy's health continued to deteriorate, and she died on the 16th of December in 1944 at the age of 59. Before she died, she told Carrie something in her heart concerning God. She says, "There is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still." And then 12 days after that, Corey was released from prison. And she was told afterwards that her release was a clerical error. And that a week later, all the women in her age group were sent to the gas chambers. She went home and still opened her doors to people with disabilities who were hiding for fear of execution. After the war, she set up a rehabilitation center in Bloemendaal. The refuge housed concentration camp survivors and until 1950 exclusively sheltered jobless Dutch who, like Jan Vogel, had collaborated with the Germans during the occupation. And after that, accepted anyone in need of care. You realize that these people, having collaborated with the enemy, nobody wanted to give them work. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with them. They were outcasts. But she went back to Germany in 1946 and met with and forgave 2 Germans who had worked at Ravensbrück, one of whom had been particularly cruel to her sister Betsy. And then Corrie went on to travel the world as a public speaker, appearing in more than 60 countries and writing several books. Joseph isn't the only one who had his brokenness turned into beauty. Forgiveness is the key to healing from brokenness. How can God heal you if you keep bitterness and unforgiveness in your heart and your mind? How can God heal you if you keep bitterness and this unforgiveness in the front of your mind? Or for that matter, in the back of your mind, anytime anything comes up, this is the filter you run everything through. So we need to lift our brokenness up to God. Why do we so often hold on to those jagged shards when they only cause us pain? Why not see what God can do if you lift those broken pieces to Him? Forgive those who betrayed you, those who talked about you, hurt you, those who wouldn't befriend you, those who turned their back on you, those who talked down to you, made you feel inferior. Forgive those who said things to you or called you names that hurt you so bad. And ask God to forgive those who hurt you, and remember that hurt people hurt people. Forgive God if you're holding it against Him for the hurt and brokenness in your life. Forgive yourself for the bad decisions you made in your life. Forgive yourself if you're holding on to the blame for the events that have taken place in your life, the situations caused by your decisions, or even the circumstances in your life right now. Acknowledge to God in prayer that you're still carrying the broken pieces inside you, and surrender that brokenness to Him. Then thank Him for the healing He's going to bring and the beauty He's going to make out of the broken pieces. I ran across a thing some time back. I was reading it to my friend Richard Baird. We were down in Tucson in January. December 20th, 1943, 21-year-old American B-17 pilot glanced outside his cockpit and froze. He blinked hard and looked again, hoping it was just a mirage, but his co-pilot stared at the same horrible vision. "My God, this is a nightmare," the co-pilot said. "He's going to destroy us." The pilot agreed. The men were looking at a gray German Messerschmitt fighter hovering just 3 feet off their wingtip. The fighter had closed in on their crippled American B-17 bomber for the kill. The pilot, Charles Brown, a West Virginia farm boy, was on his first combat mission. His bomber had been shot to pieces by swarming fighters, and his plane, alone, struggling to stay in the skies above Germany. Half his crew was wounded. The tail gunner was dead, his blood frozen in icicles over the machine gun. When Brown and his co-pilot, Spencer Pinky Luke, looked at the fighter pilot again, something odd happened. The German didn't pull the trigger. He stared back at the bomber in amazement and respect. Instead of pressing the attack, he nodded at Brown and saluted. What happened next was one of the most remarkable acts of chivalry recorded during World War II. Charles Brown was on his first combat mission when he met an enemy unlike any other. Revenge, not honor, is what drove Second Lieutenant Franz Stigler to jump into his fighter that day in 1943. He wasn't just any fighter pilot. He was an ace. One more kill and he would win the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for valor. American planes had killed Stigler's comrades and were bombing his country's cities. He was standing near his fighter on a German air base when he heard a bomber's engine. Looking up, he saw B-17 flying so low, it looked like it was going to land. As the bomber disappeared behind some trees, Stigler tossed his cigarette aside, saluted a ground crewman, and took off in pursuit. As his fighter rose to meet the bomber, he decided to attack it from behind. He climbed behind the sputtering bomber, squinted into his gun sight, placed his hand on the trigger. He was about to fire when he hesitated. He was baffled. No one in the bomber fired at him. He looked closer at the tail gunner. He was still, his white fleece collar soaked with blood. Stigler craned his neck to examine the rest of the bomber. Its skin had been peeled away by shells, its guns knocked out, one propeller wasn't turning, smoke trailed from another engine. He could see men huddled inside the shattered plane, tending to the wounds of other crewmen. Then he nudged his plane alongside the bomber's wings and locked eyes with the pilot, whose eyes were wide with shock and horror. Stigler pressed his hand over the rosary he kept in his flight jacket. He eased his finger off the trigger. He couldn't shoot. It would be murder. He wasn't only motivated by vengeance that day, he also lived by a code. He could trace his family's ancestry to knights in the 16th century Europe. He had once studied to be a priest. A German pilot who spared the enemy, though, risked death in Nazi Germany. If someone reported him, he would be executed. But he could also hear the voice of his commanding officer who had once told him, "You follow the rules of war for you, not your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity." So alone with the crippled bomber, Stigler changed his mission. He nodded at the American pilot and began flying in formation so German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground wouldn't shoot down the slow-moving bomber. The Luftwaffe had B-17s of their own that had been shot down and rebuilt for secret missions and training. So he escorted the bomber over the North Sea and took one last look at the American pilot. Then he saluted him, peeled his fighter away, and returned to Germany. "Good luck," Stigler said to himself. "You're in God's hands now." He didn't think the B-17 could make it back to England and wondered for years what happened to the American pilot and crew that he'd encountered in combat. As he watched the German fighter peel away that December day, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown wasn't thinking of the philosophical connection between enemies. He was thinking of survival. He flew his crippled plane, filled with wounded, back to his base in England and landed with one of 4 engines knocked out, one failing and barely any fuel left. After his bomber came to a stop, he leaned back in his chair and put a hand over a pocket Bible he kept in his flight jacket. Then he sat in silence. He flew more missions before the war ended. Life moved on. He got married, had 2 daughters, supervised foreign aid for the U.S. State Department during the Vietnam War. Eventually retired to Florida. Later in life, though, the encounter with the German pilot began to gnaw at him. He started having nightmares, but in his dream, he wasn't spared. There was a crash. Him. But he would wake just before his bomber crashed. He took on a new mission. He had to find that German pilot. Who was he? Why did he save my life? He scoured military archives in the U.S. and England. He attended a pilots' reunion, shared his story. He finally placed an ad in a German newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots, retelling the story and asked if anyone knew the pilot. On January 18th, 1990, he got a letter. He opened it and read, "Dear Charles, all these years I wondered what happened to that B-17. Did she make it home? Did her crew survive their wounds? To hear of your survival has filled me with indescribable joy." It was his enemy. He had left Germany after the war. He left Germany, moved to Vancouver, British Columbia in 1953, became a prosperous businessman. Now retired, Stigler told Brown that he would be in Florida come summer, and it sure would be nice to talk about our encounter. Brown was so excited, though, he couldn't wait to see Stigler. He called directory assistance for Vancouver, asked whether there was a number for Franz Stigler, dialed the number. Stigler picked up. "My God, it's you," Brown shouted as tears ran down his cheeks. Brown had to do more. He wrote a letter to Stigler in which he said, "To say thank you, thank you, thank you on behalf of my surviving crew members and their families appears totally inadequate." One of Brown's friends was there to record the summer reunion in Florida. Both men looked like retired businessmen. They were plump, sporting neat ties and formal shirts. They fell in each other's arms and wept and laughed. They talked about their encounter in a light, jovial tone. The mood then changed. Someone asked Stigler what he thought about Brown. Stigler sighed and his square jaw tightened. He began to fight back tears before he said in heavily accented English, "I love you, Charlie." The rest of the story, Stigler had lost his brother, along with his friends and his country. He was virtually exiled by his countrymen after the war. There were 28,000 pilots who fought for the German Air Force, and only 1,200 of those survived. The war cost him everything. Charlie Brown was the only good thing that came out of World War II for Franz. It was the same thing. It was the one thing he could be proud of. The meeting helped Brown as well, according to his daughter, who's named Dawn Warner. Brown and Stigler became pals. They would take fishing trips together. They'd fly cross-country to each other's homes and take road trips together, share their story at schools, veterans reunions. Their wives, Jackie Brown and Haya Stigler, became friends. Brown's daughter said her father would worry about Stigler's health and constantly check in on him. It wasn't just for show, she said. They really did feel for each other. They talked about once a week. As his friendship with Stigler deepened, something else happened to her father, Warner says. The nightmares went away. Brown had written a letter of thanks to Stigler, but one day he showed the extent of his gratitude. He organized a reunion of his surviving crew members along with their extended families. He invited Stigler as a guest of honor. During the reunion, a video was played showing all the faces of the people that now live, children, grandchildren, relatives, because of Stigler's act of chivalry. Stigler watched the film from his seat of honor. Everyone was crying, not just him, Warner said. Stigler and Brown died within months of each other in 2008. Stigler was 92, Brown was 87. They had started off as enemies, became friends, and then something more. After he died, his daughter was searching through Brown's library when she came across a book on German fighter jets. Stigler had given the book to Brown. Both were country boys who loved to read about planes. Warner opened the book and saw an inscription Stigler had written to Brown. In 1940, I lost my brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 4 days before Christmas, which should be 5 days, I had the chance to save a B-17 from her destruction, a plane so badly damaged it was a wonder that she was still flying. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. Forgiveness. The brokenness put back together. And I can't believe I'm done early with all the notes I had. Okay, 11:05 for worship service.